All right. So, as I said, the topic that we are discussing today is the history of political theory from uh, from Plato to Hobbes. Um, and as I've told you, like and you must have got this from the reading, is that the reason why we are doing political history and why it is important and why specifically from Plato to Hobbes, like what is the significance of these two thinkers that we just, sort of use them as markers of some sort of an era, a sort of a paradigm shift in the way that we think about legal theory. Um, Firstly, on the importance of studying the history of legal theory, of course, in the reading, you must have come across the entire idea of, the need to sort of, deal with, to understand the ideas that and the assumptions that we almost uncritically just take as a fact. We need to recognize that these things are not always the case, right? And in different times, people have thought of differently of political institutions, of political legitimacy, and the question of political obligation, right? And the way that they thought about it manifested in the way that institutions were governed, in which in the manner in which governments function, in the values that people attributed to the state and the laws. So yeah, it is important in that respect to understand political theory. And throughout the course of the class, I mean, you please feel free to raise questions. Raise your hand. I can see if anyone raises their hands, and whenever like I get the time, I'll just in between I'll just stop and take questions. So one important another important reason that that we need to study political the history of political theory, so the history of any sort of ideas, is the notion that, as Nietzsche put it, that the truth of things cannot be separated from the process of their creation, right? So the manner in which they come about cannot be decoupled from the value or the importance or the actual critical place in the thought structure of any age, right? So the how they came about is as much important as what they are, so to speak. So it is keeping in mind this that we sort of move towards this discussion regarding political history. And coming back to the question of why Plato and Hobbes, what is special about these two thinkers, or these two periods, basically. Of course, um, people have thought about their place um, in society, in human organization, as long as organizations have existed, right? Political organizations, social organizations existed. But the reason we accord the Greeks among all the ancient people so much importance is that they left the most highest amount of substantial record of their thoughts and beliefs, and the levels of sophistication and abstraction that they reached was not, this was comparable, it was incomparable to any other any other sort of earlier elements of the Western civilization. And I say Western civilization because it is important to recognize that that is the scope of our discussion, because the thinkers that you will be discussing in your social contract theories are Western philosophers. The genesis that you need to understand is also of Western thought. So yeah, please feel free to turn on your cameras. That will be nice for once. So yeah, so when we're talking about Western philosophers, the origin of origin of their thinking also lies in prior Western thought. And they were, of course, they had read them, they had understood them, and they were like either disagreeing with them or agreeing with them on certain points, and they were like raising or defeating certain certain opinions that these earlier thinkers had. So yeah, there's a continuity in the Western tradition, and this is why we need to sort of talk about the Western tradition in isolation here, and that is a limitation of our study. You can say that, and I'll reference like Indian thinkers here and there, but and Eastern thinkers probably, but like the whole sum and substance of our discussion will mainly pertain to Western thinkers, right? So among the ancient Western thinkers, the Greeks were very important because they were thinking at a level of sophistication that their peers could not achieve, right? And then we have sufficient written records of the same. And why Plato? And what is so distinct about Plato? Of course, there have been philosophers before Plato and after Plato. And what makes Plato distinct? The first philosopher that we consider in the Western tradition was Thales. Thales came up with this idea that, he was trying to basically figure out what is the basic principle as to how the world works. And he said that everything is at the end of the day water. Everything is consists of water. That was a conclusion that he reached, to which to our modern sensibilities will seem very ridiculous, right? But what is important is not the conclusion that Thales reached, but the process that he was using and what he was trying to do. In that he was trying to understand the basic mechanisms on which the world worked, basically. And it is this endeavor that inspired future philosophers to correct and to rethink the findings of Thales, and this sort of engendered a process through which thinkers started engaging with the question of of course, in the beginning they were just concerned with natural world, but slowly they started talking about the physical world as well. And one of the first thinkers that talked about human relations, human society, and the concerns of people, one of the first thinkers who talked about it was Socrates, and Socrates' famed student Plato. So before we get to that, I think it is important to give some historical context of the things that we're talking about. I mean, who were the Greeks, right? It is important for us to understand that. So the Greeks were the people, I mean, as the name suggests, that who inhabited the region that we even today call Greece, right? But of course, that is not what they called themselves. I mean, they did not call themselves Greek. Greek is actually what we today refer to them as. But they I think they called themselves Hellenes. Hellenes, or I mean, some word, some derivative of that. I'm not exactly sure of how you pronounce that in Greek, but like, yeah. So that is what, because the word that that the age of Greece that we refer to as the Hellenistic age, this comes from the word Helen, from the goddess Helena, right? So so the Greeks were, we refer to them as a collective, but in fact they were a congregation of various small city states that they used to refer to as polis, right? And the word political, incidentally, also comes from the term polis in this. And there's no exact translation of the term polis in English, so we just because it can be translated as both city and state, so we just refer to them as city state. So there were many city states in Greece, most particularly Athens, Sparta, Macedon, etc. Right. And their political and social organization also differed to a great extent. A contrast can be drawn between Athens and Sparta, for instance, right? Athens was a democracy, not democracy that we think of it in today's term. Of course, today when we're talking about democracy, we're mostly referring to parliamentary democracy. But when we're talking about the Greeks, what we're talking about is essentially direct democracy, that every adult male citizen had direct involvement in the affairs of every adult free citizens was involved in the politics of of Athens, and all the day-to-day decisions, all the decisions of political importance were taken by people in big, who gathered in big assemblies, whether it be deciding the trials, whether it be foreign policy, whether it be something like defense, etc. All these decisions are taken collectively. Of course, when we're talking about adult free male citizens, what we're talking about, that it excludes minors, it excluded women, it excluded slaves, right? So the franchise of these Greek democracies was very limited, but democracy, in the sense, if we understand it to be rule of the people, the purest form of democracy that was ever followed was followed in these Greek city-states, because every citizen was directly involved, as opposed to representative forms of democracy that we follow today, that we send our representatives to parliament and they represent our interests. As stark contrast to the politics of Athens, we had the politics of Sparta, where the state involvement in the lives of citizens was extremely high, because essentially what Sparta was a military city-state, right? So the city-state was ruled by an absolute monarch, who was the king, who was also a military general, who led the people, and surprisingly, the Spartan state had a larger involvement of women in its day-to-day lives as compared to Athens, right? Where women were confined to their households. And in Sparta, I mean, they still could not be part of political processes, but they still had the right to own property and to dispose of property, and to have nominal rights and citizenships in society. So and the basic primary foundation of the ground on which people sort of dealt with the questions of political obligation and the questions of political legitimacy was through the belief in gods, right? Everyone believed that their city-states laws were grounded in some divine edict, to say. Athenians believed that the origins of their laws were with the god Zeus, right? The absolute gods, the absolute Greek god, who was like the patriarch of the entire Greek god family. And the Spartans believed that their laws originated from the king Apollo, who was the god of the sun, the great and the powerful, right? So and the fact that they believed in the divine origin of the laws was had less to do with the fact that they actively were thinking, contemplating these things, but rather lying in the uncritical acceptance of these notions as as sort of grounding for our as the grounding for our for political beliefs and for beliefs of political legitimacy and obligation. Then, of course, Socrates came along, and as you know, Socrates, the famed philosopher, was convicted to death by drinking the poison hemlock for disobeying the gods of the state and corrupting the youth of Athens, right? Socrates defended himself in a trial that is recorded in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, where he sort of said that he has always been, faithful to the gods of, has always been faithful to the gods of Athens, and what he believed that he was doing was, forwarding truth, and his fidelity was to truth and philosophy, and he did not believe in doing whatever he did anything wrong, right? So Socrates was famous for, going to people in the Athenian agora and, questioning them about things. Like you ask them something like, what is justice, or, what is beauty? And then, these people who sort of, unfortunate people who sort of got into a dialogue with Socrates, they would talk about how, oh, Socrates, justice is, doing unto, being fair to your enemies and being, unkind to your, being fair to your friends and unkind to your enemies, or something like that. And then Socrates would get into a dialogue with, this person, and basically in the end he would prove that, nah, man, you're wrong. You don't actually know what justice is or what beauty is, because you're talking about particular instances of justice, particular instances of beauty. You don't get the idea of what, beauty is or justice is an abstract value, right? And this idea that, that people do not actually understand, what these concepts mean, was taken up by Plato, right, in his theory of forms, where he said that there is a difference between particular instances of beauty, justice, and the form or the idea of beauty, justice, which is perfect, which is atemporal, which does not change with time, is always stays constant, right? And particular instances of beauty, justice, or, for example, something that is beautiful today, like a flower, may not be beautiful tomorrow, because, these things, that the physical realm is always changing, and, in the physical realm cannot provide us with a sort of constance, a sort of unchangeability, and the sort of universality that we require to have true knowledge, so to speak, right? So he claimed, he built his theory of forms in this idea that, there are these forms of the concepts of beauty, of justice, etc., etc. And in order to understand them, in order to truly understand what justice is, you need to grasp these ideas, right? You need to grasp these thoughts, in these forms, and understand them. And without understanding them, you cannot really administer justice, and you cannot really, administer, and you cannot really understand beauty. So that was basically the idea of Plato. And in his book, The Republic, he sort of, undertakes a construction of a just city, right? A perfect city, where everything would be, according to the idea of justice, to the form of justice. So in this book, what he tries to do is that he constructs the idea of a just man, and a just individual, and a just city, right? He says that everyone has, three, everyone's soul has three parts, right? One is the rational part of the soul, right, and which sort of seeks truth. One, the other is the spirited part of the soul, which seeks honor. And the third is the appetitive part of the soul, which, just seeks materialistic things like money, wealth, food, drinks, whatever, right? So these three, he consisted as the, this is the basically the makeup of a human soul. And, these ideas later picked up by thinkers like Freud, who talked about id, superego, ego. If you had studied psychology in 12th, you'd have a basic idea. So he says that this three, like these souls, like, are basic, this is basically the constitution of our soul. And to be a just individual, there needs to be harmony of these elements, right? That each no part of the soul should, should conquer all the other. There should be a balance struck between them. Like, for example, if the appetitive part is too much, you would be an honorless individual who lives in falsity. If you seek honor too much, you would forget, you would seek honor wrongly and be, guilty of untruth. And if you seek only truth, then, you have ignoring your appetitive part, you'll basically die. You don't have money, you won't eat, you'll die, right? So a just individual is basically the balancing of these considerations. And the just city, on the other hand, like a just soul has three parts, a just city also has three parts in its constituents, right? One is the ruling class, the second is the guardian class, and third is the producer, the producing class, right? The producing class, in some sense, is like the appetitive part of the soul, right? The producers are like people, like, they are farmers, masons, blacksmiths, who sort of produce things. Guardians are the people who protect the city. from foreign aggression, from internal conflict, etc., etc. And the ruling class is one that sort of rules over, administers the functioning of the city, right? And he said the ruling class, and in fact the entire city, should be headed by one of the finest philosopher of the ruling class, right? And that philosopher he called the Philosopher King, who shall justly rule the kingdom, the just city, right? So in the imagination of Plato, why should a philosopher be a king? The perfect philosopher of the perfect city should be the king, is because then that philosopher can understand what justice means, and can understand what beauty means, and then construct the city in a perfect image, so to speak, right? So that is basically Plato's political philosophy, which is, of course, you would notice is very different from the idea of a democratic form of government, which Plato disliked, which Socrates disliked for various reasons, because the idea that of what basically a democratic form of government does is that it does not rule by reason, it rules by numbers, right? If the numbers are high, you can basically get away with anything. That doesn't matter how unjust these actions are, doesn't matter how untrue these actions are. So in Plato, what we find is a sort of a construction, ideal construction of a just city, right? If you want to create Plato's just city, you need to first remove everything, like remove all the political structure, all the social structures of that are existing in a society, and then build a city from the ground up in the nature of this idea of a true city, right? So that was Plato, because he was the first person who sort of laid down a sort of a elaborate political idea of justice and of politics, and how basically governance should be done, right? Plato was one of the first. Of course, people had commented upon this, as to how cities are run, and how relations between states are concerned. For example, Thucydides was a Greek historian and philosopher who sort of talked about the issues surrounding the conflict between the city states, in the Peloponnesian War, which sort of took place between Athens and Sparta, and sort of commented about that. You'll encounter Thucydides in your second semester when you will study international relations, because Thucydides is concerned is supposed to be one of the founders of the realist school of international relations, right? He was one of the first people who talked about in pragmatic terms as to how city states govern themselves and relations among each other, right? That's why he earns the honor of being one of the early realists, along with Sun Tzu of China, the famed author of The Art of War, and Chanakya of India, the author of Arthashastra and Chanakya Niti, right? So Thucydides, of course, people were talking about these things, but it was Plato who first gave this idea of a just city, of an ideal city, of how a city should look like from the ground up, right? There were many things that the children should not be should not be reared by families; they should be reared communally, and people, and these children should be taught from a very young age. If they are to be guardians, they'll be trained in a manner that they'll be trained in a manner that is fit for a guardian. If they have to be producers, they'll be trained in a manner that is fit to be a producer, etc., etc. Right? So this social engineering at a massive scale was done by Plato, and in his idea, and of course his idea were very influential, and we'll come to that when we carry on our discussion, right? Plato's student Aristotle disagreed with his idea of disagreed with, of course, his political ideas, but more fundamentally, his metaphysical ideas concerning the nature of truth and how it functions, right? Aristotle did not believe that there was that forms were sort of this atemporal entity which were out there in the universe, in an atemporal, aspatial world of their own, right? Where, the humans do not have any, basically in a world distinct from humans, right? Aristotle did not believe that. Aristotle believed that yeah, sure, the world consists of both matter and form, right? In the sense that it consists of both an eternal unchanging idea and also the the physical things that are there. But at the same time, these what these ideas are, these forms are not something that are separate from this world. They're part of this world. They're basically a homogeny that exists, a commonality that exists in things, right? They're naturally occurring, and and they do not have this sort of a transcendental origin, so to speak, right? And of course, similarly, he did not believe that we need to construct a city in the image of a true idea of a city, in a sense that we need to look to an idea of justice that is transcendental to construct our cities, in order to construct such cities that are just. His philosophy very much focused on the idea of distributive justice, right? uh, which can be looked as an early form of the idea of substantive equality that we go by today. It has its origin in Aristotle, that the fact that you should treat equals equally and unequals unequally, etc., etc. Of course, the thinking in that time was in a very primitive sense, and of course, his idea also involved that, okay, for instance, a student who, equality should be there, but a student who does better than another student, in an exam, deserves a better grade than the inferior student, right, so to speak. So that does not violate the idea of equality, distributive justice, because goods are distributed justly here. And this idea that, a wealthy man is wealthier because this wealthier man is more noble than the slave or the poor man. So this idea was still there, that there is inherent nobility in certain ideas, and there is inherent and there is like people who are born better than others. For example, he believed that slaves deserve to be slaves because they're not fit for anything other than being slaves, and he's thought that women are essentially inferior than men, and that is why they have lower political participation, etc., etc. So of course, Aristotle's idea of distributive justice was very primitive, and of course, we would see it anything as justice in today's sense of the term, but like, yeah, that was a beginning of the evolution of these ideas. I mean, we cannot really blame Aristotle, because these concepts did not, sort of start being addressed until the very last century. So, I mean, we did not do, much in the 2000 years. So we don't have Aristotle to blame for much. Anyway, so these were the two important Greek thinkers. Let's now go into, next we'll talk about Roman history. So let me just give you, I mean, you must have heard of the story of the founding of the Roman Empire, right? Rome lies to the west of Greece, right? And the Roman Empire is said to, of course, a lot of it, the origin of Roman Empire is shrouded in legend rather than recorded history. So recorded and accurate history. So, it is said that Rome was founded somewhere around 758 BC, although the dates are always in a question, because we don't have reliable sources for it. Because what they used to do was shift around the dates in these cases, so that, for example, I think some of the Roman historians, shifted the date of founding of the Roman Republic just before the founding of the Greek democracy, because they wanted to be first in everything and stuff like that. So, so we don't really have a adequate record of, Romulus and Remus were, was said to be the two founders. Romulus and Remus were said to be the two founders of Rome. And things, I mean, there is a long story. In the end, what happens is that Romulus kills Remus and becomes the first king of Rome, and probably why we know it as Rome instead of Rheme, which I think is a much better name, man. Rheme is just atrocious. Anyway, so where was I? Yeah. Talking about Rome, the founding of Rome. So Rome, the political institutions of Rome were founded by Romulus. Among the people who sort of, he just opened invitation for people to join at his city, come and live here. And most people who sort of joined, the early founding of Rome in its early founding days were not people of the most credible, most credible track record of being good people. Because of course, if you are an established, wealthy, person in another city, why would you go to another city? And you'd go to another city probably to look for a second chance, or just to move away from people, from a place that people don't like you. So it was, the first citizens of Rome were basically criminals and thieves and thugs. Anyway, So that was the founding of Rome, and the King Romulus, this sort of kept chose 100 people from the citizens to make the first Republican Senate, right? And the people who sort of trace their origin to these original 100 people are said to be of patrician origin, which were the upper class, and the rest were supposed to be plebeians or the lower classes. So this class distinction is very important because it is at the heart of like internal politics in Rome. So yeah, so Rome had 7 kings in the beginning before it became a full-fledged republic. The first king was Romulus. The second king was Numa, right? And King Numa is very important because he was, while Romulus is said to be the political founder of Rome, Numa is said to be the cultural founder of Rome, and he's basically responsible for everything cultural and moral regarding Rome. The Temple of Jupiter, the early Roman religion, all of them was founded by Numa, and also the office of what's that called? Maximus. What was that? The chief priest of Rome. What was he called? Wait, just a quick Google. Yeah, the Pontifex Maximus, right? The Pontifex Maximus was basically the supreme head of the religious institutions of Rome, and this was an office that was founded by Numa. And it is important because there we can trace the continuity of the office of what we today call the Pope to the office of the Pontifex Maximus, in the Roman Empire. I mean, because they enjoyed similar kind of prestige and office in the Roman Empire. And after the Roman Empire got Christianized with the coming of Constantine, etc., etc., the office of Pontifex Maximus slowly gave way to the office of Pope, and it still continues today. So we have Numa to thank for the office of Pope in some ways. So yeah, after Numa, we had 4 more kings. I'm not going to talk about them because they're pretty insignificant. The last king is not insignificant because he is the source of all the trouble and the entire hatred of Romans towards monarchy or any form of absolute government, right? So the last last of the 7 kings of Rome was Tarquinius Superbus, who was in many ways a tyrant, right? And because he was a tyrant, people did not like him, and in the end, what happened, long story short, he got assassinated, and then the Romans swore, as the legend goes, Romans swore that they would never allow from this date onwards to ever have a single man hold absolute power in Rome. And that is supposed to be the founding of the Roman Republic, where the office of the king ceased to be, and in some ways it never returned, but in many ways it did. We'll come to that. So after the death, I mean, that death of Tarquinius Superbus, what they did was the office of the king was replaced by the office of the consul, right? And who was the consul? Consuls were basically two people selected amongst the senators by a democratic vote to head the Roman Republic, militarily, politically. And these people are to be changed every year through elections, right? So what it does, why have 2 people? Because if one person tries to seek the absolute power, the other person will kill him, right? Because no person shall have absolute power in Rome, right? Sic temper tyrannis, thus be to all tyrants. And this is the code that Romans live by. If anyone, tried to gain absolute power, the Roman citizen was legally allowed to kill them. We know what happened to Julius Caesar, sic semper tyrannis. We'll come to that. So after the death of Tarquinius Superbus, we had the foundation of the Roman Republic, which was a very it's a very monumental moment in Western political history, and also the history of political theory, as we'll go on to see. After the founding of Roman Republic, of course, the class issues always came about, between the between the plebs and the patricians, right? And of course there was a power struggle between them, and the origin of laws, I mean the 12 tables of Rome, or which is supposed to be the foundation of the Roman law, which in some sense served as the predecessor to the civil law system that exists in continental Europe and countries like Japan, etc., was founded in many ways in the early days of Roman Republic, right? So because of this conflict, I mean, there's a long story that happened. I'm just trying to summarize things just to give you a brief idea. What happened that because of the extreme power imbalance that was present in between the people, who sort of between um, the power imbalance that existed between the plebeians and the patricians, because all senators were patricians or consuls were patricians. So basically, they had absolute power. Pontifex Maximus was also a patrician, right? So because of these things, what happened at the end of the day? The plebeians, the plebs said, okay, you know what? I mean, this is an unfair game. We want our share of political power as well. So they said, fine, they laid down the basically, the 12 tables of Rome to sort of, to ensure that the interests of the plebeians are not trampled, unjustly. And also the office of tribunate was installed, which was sort of a equivalent of the office of consul, but for the plebeians. The tribunates were always plebeians, right? So this power imbalance, I mean, was solved through this measure, and of course, the history of power imbalance goes on. But one of the most remarkable things about Romans was that whenever there was peace, they always fought amongst themselves. I mean, internal strifes, internal struggles were there, but when an external enemy threatened, Rome, doesn't matter if you're plebeian or you're or you're patrician, you're fighting for Rome. So there was unity there. So in the early years of the Roman Republic, there were many wars. The Latin wars were there, the Samnite wars, the Punic wars were there, which sort of kept the focus of the Romans to the frontier, right? And basically the internal issues were sort of ignored in the process, because you have the external enemy. So in many says, what Carl Schmitt says, that that external aggression and this construction of an enemy is what unites people together. In many ways that is not wrong, because that is what happened in the Roman Republic, right? Because of the external threats, people were like united and stuff. But after the fall of Carthage, the biggest arch enemy of Rome, in the Punic War, in the Second Punic War, what basically happened that Rome did not have any big power that sort of challenged it, and politically, militarily. So what happened was that, because as Rome was very prosperous, there was a lot of money, but because of at the same time, this money was not equally distributed. The patricians were disproportionately rich, had disproportionate amount of land, and as a consequence of what happened, that because because the plebeians were involved in long military conflicts, outside their empire. What happened was that their farmlands and their cultivations were in neglect, and as a result, they went into debt. They had to borrow money from these patrician money lenders, and because they could not repay them, then the patricians had them as bonded laborers. So you had this expansion in the number of bonded laborers inside the bonded laborer citizens inside the Roman Republic, which were largely from almost exclusively from the class of plebs and plebeians, and the patricians were disproportionately rich, had disproportionate amounts of land. So yeah, and of course, after the end of the Punic Wars, that is the sort of there's no external enemy, so people just started infighting among themselves, right? And there were many people who rose to the cause of the plebeians, right? And there was this sort of a division between the Roman Republic, between the people who sort of supported the Roman Republic and the Roman, and the sort of the rule of the rule of by the Roman constitution, where 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 patricians and plebeians shared power, but patricians had a disproportionate share of power. And this other set of people who believe that this system is wrong, this system is unjust, we need to pull it down, right? And many people who sort of, almost to a dictatorial extent, they try to grab power from the through the popular support of the people to the detriment of the republic. And I mean, it is not very easy to just draw who's a good person and who's a bad person here, because of course, while Republicans stressed on the the need to resist from having an absolute person in power, they were also have this this sort of agenda behind ulterior motive, that this system of republicanism helped them protect their wealth from being redistributed and stuff. And on the other hand, these people who sort of supported the dictatorial powers of some very charismatic individuals who promised that they will engender equality, distribute land, etc., etc. These people were also gaining popularity, right? So I mean, this conflict drew on for long, and what we see slowly is that the Republican spirit that is there in the Roman Republic started waning, and that is where one of next of our great thinkers in the line of the Western political tradition come, and that is Cicero, right? Cicero was a Roman patrician person who was a senator, who also served as consul for a while. He was also a very great philosopher. And when you study natural law, while studying legal philosophy, you must have come across Cicero already. If you haven't, you'll come across Cicero in your third year. I know that because I've looked at the course syllabus. Anyway, so Cicero was in favor of, was a staunch supporter of the republican form of government, right? And yeah, excellent orator, and he's said to be one of the greatest orators of Western history, right? And Cicero was of course, he was a staunch Republican. He was a staunch supporter of the Republican government. Why? Because he believed that it's represented a mixed form of government, right? I mean, what are the Aristotle in his work talked about three types of governments, right? That there are democracies, rule of the many; oligarchies, rule of the few; and monarchies, which is the rule of the one, right? All of them have their pros and cons. Monarchy, efficient working, less disagreements, but there's a power of absolute power corrupting, right? In oligarchies, the positive things that there are less people, so deliberations are easy. There's no chance of absolute power grab, but there is also a chance that that these people will monopolize their benefit, because of course oligarchies mein kaun who will rule? Of course the richest and the most powerful will rule, right? And then of course the democracy, which is the rule of the many, which ensures that there is no rule of the many is also the rule of the poor, right? I mean, the rule of the masses, because the masses are always there is inequality of wealth at all times, right? So in that sense, there is no disproportionate the rules are not such that they're disproportionately favoring the rich, but at the same time, because democracies are very tumultuous, the democracies are very everywhere, it is very difficult to take rational decisions, right? So Cicero thought that what republicanism did is that it combined the best elements of all these systems, right? Because there are two consuls, it has the sort of integrity as a monarchy does, because there is only a small section of people who are ruling instead of everyone. We have a system that is similar to an oligarchy, but at the end of the day, it is there are elements of democracy also there, because some people are represented either in the popular assemblies or in the tribunate, or in the Senate and the consulship, right? So there is like a large population that is being represented in this case. So yeah, so it is because of this that he thought that this is the best government, because it's a syncretic form of government, it's a mixed form of government, combines the best element of all these possible forms of government, right? And that is why he sought to protect the Roman Empire from people who sort of tried to who sort of disagreed with its founding principles and sort of worked towards atrophying it as a system, right? And the most popular among them is, of course, Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was a politician, was Pontifex Maximus for a small amount of time, deeply passionate man, very charismatic person, right? He, along with Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, along with this, and Pompey Maximus, I think, yeah, that was his full name. They formed what is called the first triumvirate, which is like triumvirate is basically a group of three people who sort of work towards their mutual interests. So they formed the first triumvirate. Yeah, Magnus. Okay, yeah, sorry, Magnus. It is not Maximus, it's Magnus. Yeah, Pompey Magnus or Magnus Pompey, whatever. Right. So all these three people sort of they they were obviously against the idea of the Roman Republic. They wanted to grab absolute power to themselves, and Julius Caesar's rhetoric of being for the people and working for the people was actually, yeah, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. Oh, thank you, Kev. Yeah. Yeah, so, and because of these, they gained a lot of popularity, and they were basically yeah, they sort of tried to, I mean, it's a long story that unfolds from there. How sort of Caesar sort of becomes so that he is one of the most powerful persons in Rome, right? To the extent that that the Roman the system of the Roman Republic was just coming to, was becoming insignificant. The power of the Senate was becoming insignificant. Yeah, and and after I mean, of course, helping each other out and defeating all their common enemies, including Cicero, what happened was that yeah, Mark Antony got Cicero killed, but I'll come to that. So yeah, so what happened was that after they sort of defended their enemies, what they did was basically turn against each other to see of the three who will become the most powerful, right? Or who will sort of, because they were not in the mood of sharing power, any of them. So yeah, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in richest man in Rome, who sort of became wealthy by exploiting essential services. The wealthiest man in Rome. Yeah, he died by having gold poured down his throat, a molten gold poured down his throat. So kind of divine justice or whatever. So he was like the Jeff Bezos of his time. But let's hope that Jeff Bezos does not meet a similar end. I'm kidding. Like, let's hope that he does. Anyway, yeah, and Pompey was basically, and after the skirmish between Caesar and Pompey fled to Egypt and to seek refuge. And the Egyptian ministers were thinking of being cunning or something. They killed Pompey and presented his head to Caesar. And Caesar was not like someone who sought vengeance upon his enemies. He had made an image out of himself, forgiving his enemies and welcoming them unto his fold. So he was really, really angered, and the Egyptians really pissed him off. They really misunderstood what actually Caesar wanted, and there was a whole thing, and a lot of people died anyway. So where was I? I'm a very bad historian, but like, yeah, I'll just giving a brief idea of events. Yeah. So after Caesar died, I mean, of course, he was the most powerful man in Rome, but and there were some good people who still believed in the spirit of the Roman Republic, and they thought that, hey, that Julius Caesar, he's a danger to the Roman Republic, right? And if we don't do anything about him, he might as well become the king of Rome, right? So yeah, so a couple of people, Brutus most a couple like a bunch of senators along with Brutus sort of get together, and they hatch a plot to kill Caesar, right? And they kill Julius Caesar, assassinate him in the Roman Senate, and yeah, sic semper tyrannis, thus be to all tyrants. And they thought that they had rescued Rome from falling into the hands of tyrants, but they couldn't be further from truth. Then Mark Antony, of course, gave his popular speech, where he saw that, he claimed that he's not there to he's not there to praise Caesar, but to bury him, and right. And, you all loved Caesar, and now look what is happening to you all. You have forgotten what he did for you, what he did for the Roman Empire, etc., etc. All the great travels that he did, he sort of, solved the problem of the Germanic tribes. He conquered parts of Britain. He just brought so much glory, so much, so much territory to the Roman Empire, and this is how you repay him, etc., etc. And that got like the crowd into a fury, and then riots started, and this like a lot of things happened. Long story short, Mark Antony and all these people, try to sort of get try to revive the legacy of Caesar in many aspects, right? So and Caesar had a nephew who was called Octavian. Like this guy Octavian and Mark Antony and one another person who was a silent partner in all these dealings. I don't remember his name. If anyone remembers, please put it in the chat box. They formed what is called the second triumvirate, right? What then happened was that they tried to revive the name of the Caesar, and tried to like sort of get this absolute control over the Roman Republic, right? And of course, Cicero was like one of the most vocal opponents of this entire scheme. And he was quiet in all these years because he was exiled, right? But after the death of Julius Caesar, I think he was recalled. Yeah. Or during the reign of the Julius, I'm not sure when he was recalled, but he was called back to the Roman Empire. But he thought that Mark Antony thought that, hey, yeah, Lepidus was the third member of the second triumvirate. Anyway, so yeah, all these people, and basically they tried to establish the sort of, I mean, unlike the first triumvirate, they were not like motivated by some egalitarian rule. They just wanted to grab absolute power, Octavian being one of them. And struggle ensued between Mark Antony and I mean, Mark Antony got Cicero killed because he wanted him to be out of his way. So that was the end of Cicero. Anyway, so Mark Antony and Octavian, and Mark Antony then, Octavian then got into skirmishes with Brutus and their allies, who were sort of still representing the last hope of some sort of order in the some sort of republican order in the Roman Empire. They got defeated, and then of course it was time for monarchy to prevail, and not monarchy, but like it was a different sort of system. I'll come to that. So what happened was that after the Mark Antony and Octavian dealt with their enemies, they tried to deal with each other, right? And yeah, in that conflict, Mark Antony got killed. Cleopatra was also involved in all of this. I forgot to mention, he was Julius Caesar's mistress, then became Mark Antony's mistress, and Octavian basically got hold of both of them. And yeah, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were soon dead. I mean, the circumstances of death are like, I mean, here and there. I'm not going to go because that is not relevant. Anyway, so Octavian becomes the sole, most powerful person in the Roman Empire now. Because Romans are so much averse to having one person have absolute power over them, Octavian sort of like instead of like going the Caesar way and claiming himself to be some sort of god figure, he tried to he learned from the mistake of Caesar and tried to conduct himself modestly, right? People sort of conferred him with titles and all this things that he rejected. And what he basically did, he just maintained himself to be just the first citizen of Rome instead of being like an absolute ruler, etc., etc. So what he did was to maintain this image that he is not the actual person in can you guys spare like 15 more minutes? I think I'll get done with at least I'll go to the dawn of Christianity, right?
Yes, it's fine.
It's fine, right? Cool. So so what happens is that Octavian tries to play off his role in the Roman Empire. What he did was to silently, undermine the authority of the Senate, but at the same time, not claiming like too much credit to himself, right? He did not call himself the emperor or any of these grand titles, but he's considered the first emperor, but he did not go by the emperor. He goes by the term princeps, or the first citizen, right, who looked after the concerns of the citizen, etc., etc. While Senate argued among themselves and failed to get get any work done, what Octavian was doing was building public roads, building public infrastructure, and everyone knew that who is doing this? It's not the Senate. They are there's just like a there's just like a social club now. Who's actually doing stuff here is the princeps. It's Octavian, right? And the Senate felt that, since he is doing so much, we should give him like some sort of title to commemorate him by. So they chose the title Augustus to go with it, right? Now, Caesar and Augustus are going to be two very important terms, because they're sort of going to be representative of autocracy for throughout the Roman Empire, right? So yeah, so Octavian basically, Octavian become Augustus, and Augustus, sort of keep playing off his involvement in the public fora, claim titles like Augustus, the Enlightened One, or the first princeps, the first citizen, etc., not claiming the titles like emperors, etc. So this is how, the what we call the emperors of Rome were basically, not called emperors, were referred to by these terms. They were called princeps, they were called Caesar, they were called Augustus. They were not called, kings or emperors, because, of course, Romans were averse to this idea, right? So yeah, and after you had like Augustus, you had this Julio Claudian dynasty, the dynasty by which we know the dynasty of Augustus by this took over. Then we had Tiberius, who sort of continued the legacy of like not being just not claiming too much authority, and just like playing off his role in sort of the Roman politics. He does that. So slowly what we see is that after Tiberius we had Caligula, the famous mad emperor who sort of killed people on whim, lit people on fire, etc., whatever, right? So he was like their classical tyrant, right? And people were horrified by this, and they were reminded, oh man, this is probably why we did not allow absolute power to be given to one person. But oh well, the days of the republic are far gone, and this is the system that we need to operate under now. Anyway, so and the era of like emperors sort of took hold in the Roman Empire. We had some emperors who were good, some emperors who were bad. But yeah, I mean, this is what the system, this is how basically the Romans saw their leader. Did not see them as like the absolute ruler of people, but they still had consuls in place. They still had these ceremonial positions in place. But the a lot of power was just shared between the Caesars, or the princeps and the Roman Republic, right? So this power sharing thing was instituted, and this is how basically things worked for like a few centuries. um yeah, we cannot go into the history of every king, of course, because this class concerns political theory. So I'll just go to the thinker, that like the king that we have to concern ourselves with. How does this princeps model of political theory just change to slowly the theory of what we call the divine right theory, right? That the ruler rules because the ruler has the mandate of the king, or of God, or the supreme deity, onto him, right? So yeah, that is a very slow and transition that sort of takes place. We have the five rulers of Pax Romana, or the peaceful period of Rome, in the between the first and the second century. We had great emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, the great philosopher king. All these people sort of ruled, and it was basically a very peaceful time for Rome. Everyone was happy, cheery, and everyone was fine with the system in place. But then Commodus came, right? Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, and he was not a good king, unlike many of the kings that preceded him. Perhaps it had to do with something with the fact that all the previous kings did not share a blood relation. They were chosen um, by the earlier kings, because of course lack of natural heir was one of the reasons, and they just wanted to elect more capable peoples to be emperors. So you see that the idea of princeps Caesar, or as today we refer to them as emperor, it was not one that was not strictly hereditary. Of course it could be hereditary, like inherited, but it was not necessarily hereditary. So but after Marcus Aurelius, just even that he saw that his son is clearly incapable of inheriting being a Roman emperor, he just sort of gave him the throne anyway. And Commodus proved to be a very bad emperor. He was more interested in going to Roman gladiators, fighting people, etc., etc. He was also one of those classical bad tyrant guys. Like Caligula and Nero. We did not talk about Nero. He's like one of the Julio Claudians. That sort of was one of the, again, considered quote unquote bad rulers anyway. So Commodus was, towards the end of the rule, he's almost said to have gone mad, right? And he sort of erected a statue of himself in the image of Hercules, right? And this was a big deal because Hercules was the son of Jupiter, the greatest god of like the Roman Empire and the Roman family of gods, right? And what he was basically saying that he is the son of God or has the legacy of God in him. Of course, it was not until much later that this theory sort of like gained prominence, but the seeds of it were laid down with the advent of with the advent of with the advent of uh, with the advent of Commodus, right? And then, of course, after the rule of Commodus, the Roman Empire did not see a strong, unified empire for a long time. People, the parts of the Roman Empire were always were always just seceding. There were revolts, conflicts, etc., etc. And the third century is said to be a time of great tumult. It's called the crisis of the third century, where the Roman Empire was almost came to the brink of dissolution. Um, at that time, the emperor who sort of put an end to the crisis of the third century was Diocletian. He was one of the greatest, considered one of the greatest emperors of the Roman Republic. What he did was basically sort of, try to reconstruct the office of the princeps, right? He said that, hey man, like we cannot have one person ruling such a vast empire, right? Because now it becomes too much of a administrative difficulty to sort of have the entire empire being just ruled by one person. So he sort of divided the office of the emperor princeps into four offices, like first two and then four offices. The senior two of the two members were supposed to be the senior members, were called the Augustus, and two junior members of this of this system of four emperors were to be called Caesars, right? And this system just got into place, and so these Caesars and Augustus were posted at different parts of the Roman Empire, defending its territory, etc., etc. And Rome sort of became, as a capital, it sort of started losing its relevance, because most of the time, the most of the time that the emperors spent was not actually spent in Rome but on the frontiers, right? So in many ways, Roman Empire ceased to be a Roman empire. It had a multicultural sort of an image, right? Now, one of the great reforms of he was responsible for many economic, social, and political reforms, which sort of laid down many institutions, that continued into the Middle Ages. For example, he established the office of dux, which later became the office of the duke, which was an important administrative office in almost all of the European kingdoms of the Middle Ages, right? So Diocletian was famous for many reforms, which sort of laid the foundation of a lot of the things that came after him, right? So Diocletian also is remembered for laying down like a systematic vision of the emperor as being someone who is you know who is who is above like normal human beings, right? He's not just the first citizen. He is someone who's more important, who's more hallowed, and who is basically different, right? So what he did was that he sort of, the way that people sort of dealt with the Augustus, or the emperor, was sort of like shrouded in like less, like, to seek an audience with the Augustus, right? To seek an audience with someone like Diocletian, you had to, pass through many doors. You had to get clearances and stuff, and you can only speak him, you had to address him with great amount of respect, etc., etc. So what these sort of attitudes did was, like, what these sort of processes did was to bring an attitudinal change in the image of the emperor in the eyes of their subjects, right? And there's a famous story that after all these things, Diocletian went back to the Roman Empire, because he had spent very little time in Rome, right? He went to Rome, for some celebrations, etc. Rome was happy that their emperor finally came home. So they threw parties and feasts, and everyone was very close and close with him. He was like, they were behaving like buddies with Diocletian. Diocletian did not like that, right? Because he felt that that the amount of triviality which people spoke with him, that really offended him, right? And because Romans were people like, hey, these offices like Augustus, Caesar, I mean, all these things are our creation, we made them. You're not something divine, you are something that is created by the agreement of the general people, right? So this sort of tension that sort of came in between the political theory at that time is very important, because moving forward we see the shift from the princeps model of the Roman Republic to a more, like, monarchical divine right model of kings, right? Where the king is considered to be just, not because so any king is considered just not because of any will of the people or whatever, but because of the divine right, because he had this, because the king had this sort of this divine significance almost in some senses. Of course, that actually comes in political theory when we talk about Christians, but yeah. So but that actually comes in Christian behavior. But this is like, Diocletian, with Diocletian we sort of lay down the foundation of these ideas, right? And the Diocletian also, like, did many religious reform, because he felt that the Roman states have many religions, right? Roman different states have many religions, and there is no very less cultural affinity between them. So he sort of gave importance to the sun god, right? The unconquered sun god, which is supposed to be a unity of different gods, right? So unlike Christian beliefs, his idea of the sun god did not represent something distinct from the Roman pagan religions and other sects, but as a sort of a unity, right, among them. All these Jupiter, all these gods, Hercules, etc., what they are basically are the aspects of this unity that is the sun god, right? Which is sort of like, harkens back to, like, takes us back to forward to an era where there is the idea of one religion, one empire, and one ruler. Sort of this takes grounding, which comes when when the empire converts to Christianity, etc. So what we are experiencing here is the shift towards a sort of a uniculturalism and monarchical form of government. Of course, we're not there yet, but it is like we're seeing a shift towards that with Diocletian, and the idea of princeps model shifting to the divine right model. Anyway, so after Diocletian, the system of four emperors did not, like, really last very long after, because without Diocletian, these people got into conflict with each other, yada yada yada. There was always, like, conflict between these rulers, and they did, they refused to recognize each other's legitimacy, etc. There was conflict. After Diocletian, the most powerful emperor, and what I think Diocletian, what one of the things that I mentioned about Diocletian is that he undertook a great persecution of Christians. Like, I mean, it is called the Great Persecution because it was, I mean, in previous years, many Roman emperors had undertook, persecution of Christians, including Nero. But, the persecution that Diocletian took was on such a large scale because, because he believed that what Christians are doing is basically corrupting, not paying allegiance to the gods of Rome, and that is causing, basically he's getting negative social credit from God because of this. So he basically undertook a great persecution of Christians, and the future emperor Constantine's father was, one of the Caesars of the western half of the empire, and he sort of, sort of underplayed, and it did not actually undertake the persecution of pagans. He just sort of did a few PR stunts and then said, yeah, I mean, this is sick, this is unreasonable, we should not do that, right? So this also already made Constantine in many ways, like Constantine's lineage in many ways, like a hero to Christians, and etc etc. Anyways, so Constantine comes. There are many socio-political reasons and personal reasons even why Constantine adopts Christianity. Firstly, people believe that he was a devout Christian himself. Secondly, the fact that we don't have conclusive proof of that, but that is a historical conjecture. Also, the fact that this we were already shifting from this model of one empire guided by one god, guided by one emperor, right? So we were moving towards that model slowly, and we see this happening with the coming of Constantine and with the engendering of Christianity. And we see it slowly Christians become Romans becoming a Christian nation. Officially, Rome did not become a Christian religion until the reign of Theodosius, but that was mainly a matter of paperwork, because by the time of Theodosius' rule, the Roman Empire was thoroughly Christianized by the incentive policies of engendered by Constantine. So I think we should stop at Constantine. From tomorrow onwards, we'll take up from the rise of Christianity. Tomorrow, I think Friday, right? We'll take from the rise of Christianity. We'll cover the thought of Saint Augustine. We'll cover the thought of Saint Thomas Aquinas, and divine right theorist of that age. And then we'll come to Hobbes and Locke, which are part of your syllabus, right? So yeah, is there any possibility that we can perhaps take a 1.5 hour class on Friday? I mean, if you guys are okay with that, or if you're not, I'll probably send you material, whatever you guys decide. I'll talk to you later about this. Anyway, so yeah, with the coming of Christianity, we're entering a new phase of how people perceive political institutions, and how this church also becomes a prominent part of politics and stuff like that. We'll discuss all that in the next lecture. And the implications of that on political theory, we'll also discuss that. So yeah, so this is all we are going to discuss today. I mean, no one raised any hands for questions. I hope I don't think that I am such an excellent orator that you got lost in my speech and forgot to ask questions. So yeah, I'm assuming that you're a bit lost. So please feel free to just ask any questions right now, or if you want, you can text me, email me, whatever, you can ask questions. So yeah, any questions before we end this class? I think I should stop the recording.